The ship is 80 feet long. 80 feet. That's smaller than most modern tennis courts. Now pack 60 men into it. Add barrels of salted meat, coils of rope, canvas sails, cannons, animals, tools, weapons, and enough biscuit to last 4 months. Seal the hatches. Push off from the dock. Watch the coast of England disappear behind you. That was it. That was their world. In the year 1500, England was reaching outward, across the Channel, toward the Atlantic, toward places that didn't yet have English names. The men who sailed those voyages were not heroes in the way we picture heroes. They were dock workers, fishermen, runaway apprentices, and younger sons with nothing to inherit. They stepped aboard a caravel because the sea paid better than the fields, or because there was nowhere else to go. What waited for them was not glory, not yet. What waited was 40 weeks of saltwater, rot, cold, and fear. This is what life was really like inside an English caravel in 1500. Picture the hull, narrow, curved, built from English oak, every plank fitted so tightly that, when new, you couldn't slide a knife between the joints. But a ship at sea is never new for long. Within weeks, the wood swells and warps. The bilge fills with a slick of seawater, animal waste, rotting food, and human filth that sits at the lowest point of the hull and never fully drains. Sailors called it the ship's breath. One account from the period describes it simply as a stench that a man never forgets and never stops smelling. The caravel had 3 masts. The foremast and mainmast carried square sails that caught the prevailing winds of the Atlantic. The aft mast carried a lateen sail, triangular, borrowed from Arab design, that allowed the ship to angle against the wind, to claw upward, when the breeze refused to cooperate. This combination made the caravel the most capable ocean vessel of its age. Fast, maneuverable, shockingly small. Above deck, there was the forecastle at the bow, a raised platform where sailors on watch scanned the horizon, and the stern castle at the rear, where the captain kept his cabin. That cabin was roughly the size of a large closet. It was considered a luxury. Below deck was everything else. Cargo, provisions, a space so low that most men couldn't stand upright. No bunks, no hammocks yet. Those came later, borrowed from indigenous Caribbean people by Spanish sailors. In 1500, an English sailor slept where he could find floor. He laid down his personal sleeping mat, which he owned, which he carried aboard himself, found a few feet of space between a barrel and a coiled rope, and closed his eyes to the sound of the hull working against the waves. Sleep rarely lasted more than 4 hours at a stretch. The ship was divided into watches, 2 teams, 4 hours on deck, 4 hours off, day and night without exception for the entire length of the voyage. There was no sleeping through the night. There was no sleeping in. There was only the bell that rang every half hour, marked by a sand glass turned by the watch, and the knowledge that when it rang 8 times, it was your turn to climb back into the wind. A man who missed his watch was beaten. It was not a complicated system. The boatswain, the bosun, was the man who made sure the ship actually worked. He was responsible for the rigging, the sails, the anchors, and the discipline of the common sailors. He carried a starter, a knotted rope end, sometimes a rattan cane. He used it freely, not out of cruelty necessarily, though cruelty was not uncommon, but out of a practical understanding that a ship with 60 men in close quarters, under constant stress, in constant danger, required an authority that could not be questioned. Above the bosun sat the master, who commanded the sailing of the ship. Above the master sat the captain, who answered to the merchants or the crown that funded the voyage. The hierarchy was absolute, and it was visible. The captain ate different food. He slept, in a separate space. He addressed the crew from the stern castle, looking down. The distance between him and the men in the hold was not just social, it was architectural, built into the ship itself. Discipline was governed by the laws of Oleron, a maritime code that predated the Tudor period and covered everything from theft to blasphemy to murder. The punishments were stark and public. A sailor caught stealing had tar poured over him and was made to run through the crew, every man striking him as he passed. A man who drew a knife on a shipmate risked losing the hand that drew it. A murderer was bound to his victim's body and thrown overboard, tied to the corpse, dragged into the Atlantic. The worst punishment was keel hauling, a sailor tied to a rope, thrown overboard, dragged under the ship's hull, encrusted with barnacles sharp as broken glass, and hauled up the other side. The few who survived were not the same men who went in, but here is what the punishments alone cannot explain. Most men came back. Most signed up again. Because for all its violence, a ship in 1500 was also one of the few places where a man with no name and no land could earn real wages, see the edge of the known world, and return to tell people something they had never heard before. That was worth something. Even to men who slept on rope mats and woke up to a bosun's stick. On the 40th day at sea, the biscuit changed. It didn't rot, not exactly. It hardened first, then darkened, then filled. The ship's biscuit, baked twice so that all moisture was driven out, was designed to last for months. And it did last, but the weevils found it first. Small, pale, soft-bodied insects that bored through the hard bread and laid their eggs inside. By 6 weeks out, nearly every piece of biscuit aboard had been colonized. Sailors learned to tap the biscuit against the table before eating. The weevils fell out. Then they ate. The daily ration aboard an English ship of this period was roughly a pound of biscuit, a half-pound of salted meat, beef or pork, packed into barrels with enough salt to preserve it for a year, and a quart of beer, wine on better supplied ships, water when nothing else remained. Fresh food was loaded at the start of every voyage, onions, garlic, lemons sometimes, live animals, goats and chickens kept in pens on deck, slaughtered over time for fresh meat. But fresh food didn't last. Within 3 weeks, the fruit was gone. Within 4, the vegetables. What remained was preserved, salted, pickled, or dried. And then quietly, the men began to slow down. It started as tiredness. A heaviness in the limbs that rest didn't fix. Then the gums began to swell. Tender at first, then painful, then bleeding at the slightest touch. Teeth loosened. Old wounds, injuries healed years before, reopened without explanation, as though the body were reversing time. The skin bruised at the pressure of a finger. The joints ached so badly that climbing the rigging became agony. They called it the scurvy. They had no idea what caused it. Some thought it was the sea air. Some thought it was punishment from God. Some thought it was caused by the smell of the bilge. None of them knew that the body requires a compound called ascorbic acid, vitamin C, and that without it, the collagen holding the body together begins to dissolve. It has been estimated that scurvy killed at least 2 million sailors between 1500 and 1800. On a major voyage of exploration in this period, ship owners and merchants assumed that roughly half the crew would not survive. They built the losses into their contracts. Half the crew, as a baseline assumption. Vasco da Gama lost 116 of his 170 men on his return voyage from India in 1499. Magellan lost 208 of his 230 men during his circumnavigation in 1520. The disease didn't discriminate between the experienced and the new, the strong and the weak. It came for everyone who stayed long enough at sea without fresh food. In 1500, none of that was understood. A sailor watching his gums bleed in the half-dark below deck knew only one thing. He was dying, and he did not know why. The Atlantic in winter is not a body of water, it is a force. A storm in the North Atlantic could begin with a change in the color of the sky, a yellowing at the horizon, a stillness in the air that sailors recognized as a trap. The experienced men began immediately, checking lines, tightening lashings, reducing sail before the wind arrived. The inexperienced ones watched the veterans and understood that something was wrong. Then the wind hit. In a storm, a caravel, 80 feet of oaken canvas, became a cork. The waves did not come from one direction. They came from every side, 15, 20, 30 feet high, walls of black water that lifted the bow and sent it crashing back down with a force that loosened every joint in the hull. Men on deck lashed themselves to the mast or the rigging to keep from being swept overboard. Men below held on to whatever was fixed and waited. The cook fires went out. In rough seas, an open fire on a wooden ship was a second disaster waiting. For days at a stretch, sometimes a week, the crew ate nothing cooked. Cold biscuit, cold salted meat, whatever could be held in one hand while the other gripped the hull. Men did go overboard. There was no rescue. There was no turning the ship back into a storm to search for a man who had vanished into 30-foot swells. The ship kept moving. The watch noted the loss. And 60 men became 59. The captain prayed. The historical record is consistent on this point. Captains of this era prayed openly, publicly, before the crew during the worst storms. They called on God and on Saint Nicholas, the patron saint of sailors, and on the Blessed Virgin, whose image was painted on the stern castle of many English ships. They made promises. If we survive this night, they said, I will give a candle to the church at Bristol. I will make a pilgrimage. I will never curse again. Sometimes the storm passed. The sky cleared. The ship lay tilted and dripping. The crew exhausted and salt-burnt. The rigging tangled. The sails torn. And the master would look at the sky, take his reading, and say, we are here. This is where we are. And they would keep going. Because the thing about men who sail in 1500 is this: they already knew when they stepped aboard that some of them would not come back. The danger was not a surprise. It was the contract. It was the price of the horizon. When an English caravel finally returned to port, Bristol, Plymouth, Southampton, it came in changed. The ship itself was battered, sails patched, hull fouled with weed and barnacles below the waterline, ropes spliced and respliced until they were more spliced than rope. The men who disembarked were not the men who had departed. They were thinner, darker from wind and sun. Some were missing fingers. Rope burns and rigging accidents took a regular toll. Some walked differently, joints stiffened by months of cold and damp. Some did not disembark at all. The ones who survived gathered what they were owed, wages calculated by the day, sometimes supplemented by a share of any cargo or prize money, and dispersed into the port towns. Some drank it within a week. Some sent it home. Some turned around almost immediately and found another ship because the sea, for all its violence, was the only life they knew how to live. What they had seen, most of them could not fully describe. They had been to the edge of the mapped world. They had seen coastlines that had no names in English. They had watched the sunset over waters that their fathers had believed to be the end of everything. The drop-off, where the ocean fell into void. And they had kept sailing, and found that the ocean continued, and that the world was larger than anyone had dared to say. That knowledge, hard-won, paid for in salt and blood, and the bodies of men left in the Atlantic, was the foundation of everything that came after. The trade routes, the colonies, the empire, the English-speaking world that now stretches across 6 continents. None of those men knew they were building it. They were just trying to get home. They were just 60 men on an 80-foot boat, 3,000 miles from England, eating Weevil biscuit and watching the horizon for something that might save them or kill them, and not always knowing which one it was going to be. History remembers the captains, the investors, the monarchs who funded the voyages and claimed the land. It forgets the man who turned the sand glass every 30 minutes, who climbed the frozen rigging in a January storm off the Azores, who tapped his biscuit on the barrel's edge each morning and watched the pale insects fall out and ate it anyway, because there was nothing else, because the sea had no doors, and because somewhere, weeks away, maybe months, there was a port and a dock and dry ground that did not move. He had a name. We don't know it, but he was there. And without him, without 10,000 men exactly like him, none of the history we inherited would have been possible.